How does Bangladesh fare while balancing Islam with secularism?
I think Bangladesh doesn't fare particularly well in trying to make what is an impossible balance. I think the foundational principles of the state were about secularism, and very strong secularism, which envisaged a complete separation of religion and state. But this peculiar admixture that developed under the military now unfortunately has been endorsed by, at that time, an elected government, is to have Islam as a state religion adjoining secularism, adjoining a recognition of the right to religious practice for others. And I think the mixture is not a healthy one. And what it really means, what we really see happening is that we see more and more sponsorship of the majority religion in different ways, more and more embracing of that. And I think even more troublingly, close association with groups that espouse really quite an extremist version of Islam, and one I think that doesn't echo with the majority of Bangladeshis at all. The kinds of views that groups like Hifazat Islam espouse, for example, are being given a considerable amount of validity and space by the current government. And I think that's an immediate sort of response to this approach.
Okay. Several achievements with regards to gender equality were mentioned through the day. However, what are the issues you think that remain unanswered?
In terms of the laws and violence that we have around public forms of violence like rape or acid attacks or trafficking, as well as the more recent legislation on domestic violence, they come very much on the back of the activism of women's rights organizations. But of course they all deal largely with criminal law. And they deal with, as I said, public violence or violence in the community. They didn't, until the Domestic Violence Act, I guess, they didn't significantly deal with acts of private violence. And I think the main area where we see there's a really obstinate refusal, I think, by the state to engage in a systematic fashion is around personal law reform. And I think that also links back to this issue around the unwillingness to look at what secularism would actually mean in practice. And I think what it would mean is at least recognizing that you have equality and you have gender equality played out through personal laws as well as through affecting the criminal law and how that operates.
Mm-hmm. The fear that the digital bill will be passed reveals that there's some continuity across governments and the state itself with regard, just as seen in the gender agenda where it was mentioned that one government has not undone what the other has done. So it's the same with the negative aspects as well. Do you think the state has systematically used legal instruments to codify and curb human rights in that sense in Bangladesh?
No, I think it's more complex than that. I think that actually there have been a number of very progressive norms that have been created through legislation. So looking at, for example, the legislation around violence against women, we have seen an incremental development where one government has built on what the achievements have been on the last. But if you look at what's happened around what is happening now around the Digital Security Act and what is in existence in terms of the Information Communication Technology Act and effectively the criminalization of certain forms of online speech. Now, those reflect a very real concern with threats posed to individual liberty, security, and so on through online speech as well. So the use of defamation, reputational attacks, the kind of threats to women, for example, particularly made through online spaces. So there's a genuine concern there that is trying to be met, I think. But at the same time, there's real overreach in terms of the existing law, which was of course made by a previous government, by the BNP Jamaat government back in 2006. But we've seen that this government, being from a completely different political point in the spectrum, has actually embraced that legislation, unfortunately, and added bells and whistles and made it even more problematic, even more draconian in terms of its application. And now in its new iteration, in terms of the digital security bill that we have, they've tried to modify some aspects of the existing law, but unfortunately they've added on new provisions which would again stifle speech in perhaps even more terrifying ways.
Yes. And in continuation with one of the things you mentioned, within the South Asian context, how is Bangladesh similar or different in terms of human rights, as well as the attack on the judiciary, which seems to be happening across South Asia?
So I think there are a lot of similarities we can see across the region right now, particularly in terms of the threats to rights organizations working around rights, movements working around rights, movements that work particularly with very marginalized communities, whether it's indigenous people, tribal groups, religious minority groups, and so on. In every country, I think we see a real threat around those spaces. At the same time, I think, as many social scientists have noted, Bangladesh has had a great deal of success around, first, of course, in terms of economic growth, and really transforming itself within this short, almost 50-year period, from a country that had experienced complete devastation to one that now has very high rates of growth, that has the world's second most successful ready-made garments export industry and so on, bigger than India's, our massive neighbor to the west. But despite that, the politics doesn't match. So this is the classic statement about Bangladesh, right? We have great economics and terrible politics. And that paradox doesn't seem to be resolved anytime soon. And I think in terms of the bad politics, as I said, we have a consolidation of power in one party. We don't have really any serious contestation from any kind of opposition party. So we have the framework of a sort of Westminster democracy, but we don't have any of the content or substance of it.
Okay. Finally, you just mentioned the paradox in the way that it's playing out. And this is also apparent in the way the narratives around Bangladesh are created. On one side, you have the human rights narrative, it's doing badly. But on the other side, it's also being embraced for the way it's reacted to the Rohingya refugee crisis. From within, how do you think this situation has come about? Like, how has this narrative been possible on two completely different tracks at the same time?
Well, I think it's important not to see it as two different tracks. You see, I think there's a real effort often we see by the powers that be inside our country, but also the same kind of reductionism that you see even in terms of how the international media particularly portrays the story. You're either a good country or you're a bad country. Either everything is wrong and you're a basket case and you're a political disaster, or you're a shining light. And I think you saw the same thing with India, with this sort of bright, shining India type of model, which we did not want to look beyond the kind of shining India picture to see what lay beneath. And I think the same thing with Bangladesh now. These are wonderful achievements, and I think they're achievements that every Bangladeshi takes pride in. It's developing, it's a middle-income country. As I said, we have the ready-made garments industry and many other successes. But that doesn't mean, the sign of actually a vibrant, healthy society should be that you're able to speak about things that don't work. The fact we have a terrible political system, the fact that we have arbitrary law enforcement, the fact that we have 100 people killed in 2 weeks in a so-called war on drugs, those are things we should be able to speak about without being labeled as anti-nationals or anti-liberation or anything like that. And I think with the Rohingya refugee crisis as well, it's incredible and wonderful that Bangladesh is housing them. The Bangladeshi state has welcomed them. The head of the Bangladesh government has been very open and has made a critically important statement of saying, with 160 million citizens, why not 1 million more? Many European states would never do the same thing. We're very conscious of that. And I think everybody welcomes that and is proud that those state positions have been taken. But at the same time, we're also very worried as citizens of Bangladesh and of a country where we had 10 million refugees at our birth who were able to come home to a newly independent country. For us, it's important that with the 1 million Rohingyas who are on our territories now, that we treat them with the respect that should be accorded to refugees, that we don't enclose them in camps, we don't refuse them the right to education, we don't refuse them the right to knowledge about their own rights and how to access them. And I think we have to be cognizant of that. That it's not enough that we just put one foot forward and are a little bit welcoming. We have to do more to be really respectful of human rights in its fullness.
All right. On that note, I will conclude this interview. Thank you so much for your time, Sara.
Thank you.